We're just a few weeks into President Trump's second term, and already his administration has taken a series of legal actions that have legal scholars raising the alarm. From defying court orders to testing the limits of executive power, many are asking, are we in the midst of a constitutional crisis? To help us break it all down, I'm joined by one of the nation's foremost constitutional scholars, Harvard Law professor Laurence Tribe. First of all, I have to ask you about the resignation of Manhattan U.S. Attorney Danielle Sassoon and five other attorneys in protest over the Justice Department's order to drop charges against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. What was your reaction when you heard that?
Well, I immediately thought that Danielle deserves to be a profile in courage. I don't know her personally, but her reputation is stellar. And as it happens, she's something of a conservative. She clerked for Justice Scalia. She has a Federalist Society connection. She is in no sense an anti-Trump person. She's not a liberal. She's simply a principled career prosecutor. And essentially, she was ordered in a remarkable letter that I've read that has become public by Emile Beauvais, the acting deputy attorney general. She was ordered to drop the prosecution of Eric Adams. Now, Eric Adams, as everyone I guess by now knows, is not exactly a model of integrity, but he hasn't yet been convicted. He was nonetheless indicted in a serious bribe scheme in which, not to get into the details, but he benefited considerably. Turkey was involved. It really looked horrible. But however it looked, the key point, and this is what was made clear to Danielle when she said, basically, I can't do this. The key point was that Beauvais, speaking for the US Department of Justice, said, now we are not asking you to drop this prosecution because we think it's weak, because we think he's innocent, because we have any problems with the legal theory or the facts. We're asking you to drop it. And I say this just with my jaw dropping. We're asking you to drop it because we want his cooperation in getting rid of a bunch of immigrants from New York City and doing it in a way that doesn't pause for any legal obstacles. We want him to do our bidding. And we think that if he has to defend himself against these charges, he won't be able to be fully loyal to us. And in particular, and this is the most amazing part, in particular, we want you to hold the charges over him for the future. We don't want you to drop them with prejudice, as lawyers say. We want you to drop them without prejudice so that he knows that if he doesn't do our bidding, we can come back after him. Now, that's everything that prosecution shouldn't be. And to her credit, she said, I can't do this. I'm willing to meet with you, but if you don't change your mind, I'm out of here. And she was joined by others, including, I noticed most dramatically, a guy named Hagan Scotton, who is also something of a conservative. He won 2 bronze medals for his military service in Iraq. He was first in his class at Harvard Law School. He clerked for Chief Justice Roberts. These are the people who left. And when they said we won't do it, proudly standing up for the tradition that lawyers are at least bound by some legal rules, they're not just tools. When they said we won't do it, Beauvais, who didn't want his own fingerprints on a motion to dismiss, knowing that that would undermine his credibility with any federal court in the future, he turned it over to the public integrity section of lawyers in Washington, D.C., and they said we'll resign rather than doing it. He, since I gather, has gathered a couple dozen lawyers in the room, given them an hour or something to say either you sign this motion to dismiss the charges against Eric Adams or you are fired. That is, in microcosm, an example of the way in which this administration has basically engaged in a hostile takeover of the United States government. Every agency, every department is now simply one of the octopus arms of the ogre in the White House. And he is doing the bidding of the world's richest man, Elon Musk, who, even though he tries to humanize himself by having his little 4-year-old son, X, his name is X, sit on his shoulders while he holds forth in the Oval Office to a dazzled Donald Trump who looks up at him in great admiration. Even though he does that, he holds no office in the United States government. He is accountable to no one, and he and his sort of mini-me's, a whole fleet of young software engineers and recent lawyers are running amok through the United States government, dismantling USAID, taking apart the Department of Education, most recently occupying the Internal Revenue Service, claiming that they have read-only access to your and my Social Security number and our tax returns and our forthcoming checks from Medicare, whereas in fact, it looks like they have writing as well as reading privileges. In other words, they are the worm inside RFK's brain. They have occupied the entire government, and we are now at the mercy of a mega billionaire. That's where we are. And some people scratch their heads and say, is this a crisis? Is this a coup? Where have they been? If this is not a break alarm, 5-alarm fire, where we must all rise up and do what we can to defend our basic system of government, I don't know what would be.
Some people don't seem to be concerned. They're saying that Donald Trump is delivering on his campaign promises to reduce the size of government. And other people are very concerned. But I have to ask you this question, even though I was going to ask you, Larry, at the end of the interview. People hear this, they're concerned, and they don't know what to do. They feel powerless and helpless. The Democrats obviously are in the minority. There's Republican control of Congress. Congress is supposed to be in a position of checks and balances, but they've pretty much abdicated their responsibility to say, wait a minute. The judiciary, I think, is trying. But before we talk about the courts, what can the average person do?
Well, I understand why you wanted to save that for last, because I could then, because I'm not necessarily going to have a wonderful menu of possibilities, I could have said, oh, well, save by the clock. The fact is, although everyone should do whatever they can, talk to their friends, join rallies, peaceful marches, there was a day when there were peaceful gatherings of tens of thousands of people in all 50 states. And a lot of people didn't seem to know about it because the mainstream media didn't say much about it. And unless you happen to be on social media that pays attention to the resistance, you might not have known. But everyone should pay attention. People should stop saying, I'm not sure that this is a big problem. They should realize that it is a problem, talk to their friends, find the places where they can protest, begin organizing for members of Congress who are more likely to hold the hostile takeover accountable. And to the extent people have disposable money, income that they can spare, they should give whatever they can to organizations, and I don't want to start naming them because there are now dozens that are putting together money to defend people against whom the administration is mobilizing its resources simply because they are deemed disloyal. They should contribute to the political efforts of those who want to replace a spineless Republican House and Senate with people who have principles and integrity and who are holding public office in order to do something for the people rather than have a sinecure for themselves.
And aren't afraid that they will lose an election because they stand up
Right.
and are true to their principles. Before we talk about some of the other things, Larry, I wanted to ask you again about Danielle Sassoon, because I think it bears repeating how unprecedented this is and what it says about the Justice Department, the US Justice Department, ostensibly, uh, apolitical operation. Of course, sometimes politics have entered into it. You had Robert Kennedy Jr. during the Kennedy administration. And, I think we could debate how apolitical it's been. But what does it say about the so-called independence of the Justice Department under Donald Trump?
Well, to begin with, Katie, the Justice Department does occupy a very complicated place in the history and structure of American government. From the beginning, when the first Attorney General was named, even before that person headed a whole department, there was a notion that it would be dangerous for the Attorney General to be essentially the personal lawyer for the president, because the Attorney General was supposed to enforce the laws passed by Congress, make sure that those who violate the criminal laws are prosecuted criminally, that those who violate civil laws are subject to civil remedies. And that might not happen if the chief executive who nominates and with the consent of the Senate appoints an attorney general is himself the wrongdoer. I mean, that's the problem. If you've got an executive branch that is a lawbreaker, and we've had that only a couple of times in our history, never as dramatically or as openly as and almost brazenly as we do now. But if you've got a chief executive who's breaking the law, he's not likely to tell his own lawyer, why don't you prosecute me? Or prosecute the people that I'm sending out to do my bidding. On the contrary, what he might do, and we're seeing it now, is send people out to do his bidding and then promise them that if they're prosecuted by a state prosecutor, for example, he'll come to their defense. And certainly if they are prosecuted by a US attorney and convicted, he'll pardon them. So there's this problem. On the one hand, the attorney general is picked by the president, can be fired by the president. And on the other hand, we're counting on the attorney general and the department that the attorney general heads to be independent enough so that they can go after the attorney general. We've tried to solve that in a lot of ways. We've had special prosecutors, special counsels. Eileen Cannon successfully ruled, although without any legal reasoning, that it's unconstitutional to have a special counsel. So we've got this fundamental problem. In the midst of that problem, we have in the past worked our way down the middle so that we've had a degree of independence for attorneys general. Certainly Merrick Garland was completely independent of Joe Biden, so much so that he dragged his feet and never held Trump accountable. Instead, he indicted Biden's son, or at least his department did. And his department indicted the Democratic, liberal, African-American mayor of the city of New York. And when people like Trump were saying, oh, that's weaponization, those who were paying attention and listening would have scratched their heads and said, what's he talking about? If they're weaponized against Democrats, against themselves. But Trump was successful in propounding this narrative that the whole government is a bunch of jerks, that they waste money, that they're doing the bidding of the Democratic Party. We've got a clean house. And so he comes in, he puts in all of these loyalists. He says, now we are de-weaponizing the department. But the way he de-weaponizes it is to pardon initially all the guys who stormed the Capitol and led to the death of police officers. He releases them as a mob that can now do his bidding, and he de-weaponizes it by dropping prosecutions of corrupt mayors like Eric Adams, and he de-weaponizes it by directing people like the chief prosecutor in Manhattan in the Southern District of New York, Danielle Sassoon, to drop that prosecution, but threatened to bring it again. So what we have is a kind of Alice in Wonderland world where words don't have their usual meaning, where up is down and black is white. It's an Orwellian world, and it's the kind of world that autocrats and would-be dictators love to create because they confuse everybody, they lead everybody to take their eyes off the ball. For example, this guy says that there was too much inflation under Biden. Now he's got to cure it. So he comes into office, and for the first month in a very long time, inflation goes up. And he says, that's the Biden inflation. And a lot of people who are busy trying to find eggs at the supermarket let him get away with it. And all of us, I think, have a responsibility in talking to each other, to our friends, to tell it like it is. Don't believe everything you hear in your selected corner of the social media. Pay attention to what the other side is saying. Look around, look at the facts, because if truth is no longer meaningful, if up is down and white is black and right is left, we are really lost. The autocrat thrives on creating an alternative reality and making us believe that everything good is his or her responsibility, and that everything that's terrible is the result of self-government and democracy. And if enough people believe that, then we are completely lost.
It's so scary, isn't it, that this is happening? I mean, I don't know how old you are, but you've lived longer even than I have.
Much longer.
And did you ever think you would see a day when democracy is so tested and so under threat?
No, never. I mean, maybe I should have. If I were more of a historian, I perhaps would have. But just objectively, I don't think in the entire history of the United States, including World War II, the Civil War, the War of 1812, we've ever seen what amounts to a hostile takeover of our own government. I mean, these people from Musk on down, and I put Musk at the top. Beneath him, I suppose the odd couple of Trump and Vance, and the horrible people around them, like Stephen Miller and so on, and Emile Beauvais. That whole crew is waging war on the United States. And the last time I looked at the relevant part of the Constitution, it defines treason as waging war against the United States Constitution or against the United States of America, or making sort of giving aid and comfort to its enemies. Well, I don't easily or lightly use the phrase enemy of the Republic to describe somebody. It always bothered me when Trump would say, you guys in the media are enemies of the state. That's the kind of language that fascists use. But these people do seem to me to be enemies of the state. They call it the deep state. They are dismantling the government. Parts of the government that ordinary citizens don't realize affect them. Take, for example, USAID. One of my former students, a brilliant woman named Samantha Power, was the head of USAID until recently. She did an amazing job. Of course, like every agency, it might have wasted a couple bucks here or there. One might have questioned some of its priorities, but it saved tens of millions of lives around the world, giving the United States sort of bragging rights. We are helping the world. That's a kind of soft power. And on top of that, a lot of what we provided with money that Congress appropriated to USAID bought agricultural commodities, helped our farmers. A lot of the stuff we send overseas, funded by USAID, helps our own economy. So what does Musk do? He says USAID is a bunch of idiots, a bunch of traitors, a bunch of fools. He tries to dismantle it. He does. He sends his team of basically kids into the government to shut down USAID. Now, as recently, I think, as Friday morning, a federal judge put a pause on that. But there's only so much federal courts can do. There are dozens of lawsuits against all of these things that Trump and Musk are doing. In all but one, Trump has lost, and temporary restraining orders have been put in place. And there's a question of whether Musk and Trump will abide by those orders or defy them. I want to set that aside for a minute. The point is, even if they obey all of these orders, do not risk being held in contempt. There's only so much that even 1,000 lawyers spread around the country among hundreds of courts can do against this battering ram that is moving at lightning speed through the entire government. How can you catch up with them? You know, they've basically dismantled, and I use the USAID example to be concrete, they've dismantled that agency. They have told the people there they have to fly home by 24 hours or they'll be immediately fired. When they land, they are fired. I don't have all the details right in front of me, but the point is it's a catastrophe for those people. They've dedicated their lives to preventing others from getting HIV/AIDS.
Yeah. And Larry, even if a judge rules against the Trump administration, I interviewed Heather Cox Richardson this week, the historian, and others have pointed out that even if a judge rules in USAID's favor, they have significantly or effectively destroyed the agency to a point where it can never be what it was before they got their hands on it.
Exactly. Heather Cox Richardson's Letters to an American, wonderful resource, daily available. Robert Hubble, a similar newsletter. They have carefully watched the destructive impact on institutions that make an enormous difference to everybody. And of course, beyond something that looks exotic and foreign like USAID, there are things that are right here at home. I mean, are you sure you're going to get your next Social Security check? Or when you rely on Medicare to pay for something? Or when you have a sick kid who needs governmentally backed health insurance?
Or if you're part of a clinical trial.
Right. I mean, those checks are in the control of the Treasury. There's a special department of Treasury that Elon Musk has now infiltrated himself into. There are two books that I would mention. One by Andy Greenberg, I think, called Sandworm, and one by Shoshana Zuboff called Surveillance Capitalism, that are all about how the hackers get inside the system, take over your software, connect it to their mainframe computers, scrape it of data, use that data to enrich themselves or to harm you and to benefit themselves against their competitors. And a guy like Musk, where StarX competes against alternatives, and you've got all kinds of businesses like Jeff Bezos and like other billionaires. These sort of cyber barons are essentially taking over the country. And we talk about, for example, Trump plays with the idea of getting a constitutional amendment to allow himself to serve a third term. By the time, given what we've seen in just 20 days or so, by the time the next election comes, it will be almost irrelevant whether he's managed to erase the part of the Constitution that says 2 terms is enough. Because even if he hasn't, he may just disregard the Constitution. He said, and people elected him anyway, he said that he was going to trash the United States Constitution. He was going to shred the parts that he found inconvenient. So, it's a fragile document. It doesn't enforce itself. It just sits there. And by the time we're done, it may be just parchment.
I wanted to ask you about this idea espoused by White House officials, including the press secretary, that everything he is doing is within his authority as the chief executive of the US. And some have suggested the administration's larger goal is to grow the power of the presidency through a legal idea known as the quote, unitary executive theory. Can you explain what that is and how they might use that?
The unitary executive theory is just fancy words for the idea that Article 2 of our Constitution gives the entire executive power, that is, the power to uphold and enforce the law, to a president of the United States, period. Now, his position is that because he's president, he must be able to hire and fire whenever he wants, based on his own priorities and not on any misconduct, anybody in the executive branch. And he defines the executive branch so broadly that it includes the Federal Reserve Board, the SEC, the whole alphabet soup of agencies, all of these agencies whose independence has enabled our economy to thrive and our financial systems to remain stable. He's moved from the idea that it's a unitary executive, which he's using to knock down various agencies and to say, I can fire, for example, even though Congress said that the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Board, the CFPB, should not be subject to being fired without cause by the president. He said, no, I don't need any cause. I can just get rid of him. And the US Supreme Court upheld that. And in fact, over time, you can predict that this court, with 3 people appointed by Trump and 3 others appointed by other Republicans, will adopt various aspects of this unitary executive theory. Exactly how many agencies they'll knock off, whether they will say that a multi-member agency also must have every member of the board subject to firing at will by the president, that's not absolutely clear. But what is clear is that they've now gone way beyond the unitary executive. No longer are they saying all executive power must be subject to the president's will. They're saying all power is executive. That is, whenever something happens, even if it looks like making a new law, even if it looks like exercising the power of the purse, which the framers put in the hands of Congress, they say, oh, that's an executive decision. For example, Congress says spend a certain amount of money on Medicare, a certain amount on child health, a certain amount on highways. And the president says, oh, that isn't consistent with my priorities. So I can disregard all of that as if I had a kind of line item veto. Well, the US Supreme Court will have something to say about that.
Well, I was going to ask you,
Yeah.
do you think the Supreme Court would rule in the Trump administration's favor, claiming this executive power?
No, I think they will go along with him insofar as he is saying, I am a single head of the executive branch, but they will not allow the executive branch to swallow the other 2 branches. When it comes to the legislative branch, which has the power to write laws and to appropriate money and say when and where it shall be spent, the court has made clear in important decisions, even these conservatives have made clear, they believe that is not an executive power. That belongs to the legislature. And I predict that they're going to stick with that. I also predict that they're going to insist on the power of another branch of government that they care a lot about, namely the judicial branch. John Roberts and his colleagues, including the most conservative, Alito and Thomas, and those that come behind him, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, and the one in the middle, Amy Coney Barrett, and of course the 3 liberals, Sotomayor and Jackson and Kagan, all 9 of them, really want their branch of government to be paramount. They believe in the importance of that old decision from 1803, Marbury v. Madison, where John Marshall, the great Chief Justice, said, "It is the province of the courts to say what the law is." Now, when people like J.D. Vance and Elon Musk and my own colleague Adrian Vermeule say, well, all the White House is saying these days through the spokesperson and others, all they're saying is that when the courts interfere with the legitimate exercise of executive power, we don't have to obey them. But of course, that raises the question, who decides what is the legitimate exercise of executive power? If it's the executive judging the legitimacy of its own actions, we have people who basically are putting themselves on trial. As I mentioned earlier, in connection with the difficulties of the president having the attorney general go after him when he is hiring and firing the attorney general, the executive, the chief executive, cannot have the last word on what is legitimate. That is what people like Adrian Vermeule and much more dramatically J.D. Vance and the White House press secretary are completely forgetting. They're making the dopey point that if what we're doing is perfectly legal, it's not legal for the judges to say otherwise. Duh. The question is, who decides? That's the question.
And in fact, I wanted to just read both J.D. Vance's tweet and then your colleague Adrian Vermeule's defense of that tweet for people who may not be aware of it. He said, J.D. Vance, quote, "If a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges are not allowed to control the executive's legitimate, keyword being legitimate power," to which your colleague, Harvard Law professor Adrian Vermeule, wrote, "If there is a crisis of any kind, it is that some judges have overlooked or willfully ignored the time-honored legal doctrines and principles that limit their own role, have exercised discretion without prudence or restraint, and have themselves consequently violated the separation of powers." Has the judiciary overstepped its authority on occasion, Larry? And does your colleague have a point at all?
Well, certainly the Supreme Court has overstepped its authority on occasion. It did that in Dobbs when, for no reason, it overruled Roe v. Wade and said, we now have the votes to say that a woman's control over her own body is not part of liberty. But I didn't hear the Democrats, including me, saying, well, because we disagree with the line they drew, we can simply disregard and defy their ruling. Yes, the Supreme Court has done all kinds of stupid and terrible things, upholding the incarceration of Japanese Americans in Korematsu, upholding slavery and the grotesque principle that the descendants of slaves can never be citizens in Dred Scott, upholding separate but equal in Plessy v. Ferguson, striking down the civil rights laws in the decisions of 1883. It's done all kinds of terrible things. But when Abraham Lincoln said of Dred Scott, although that can't be the last word in the history of the United States on a big question like slavery, we have to obey it as long as it is the law. My colleague Adrian is trying desperately. Why, I don't know, because he's a good guy and very smart. He's trying desperately to say, nothing to see here, move right on. My friends in the Trump administration aren't saying anything extraordinary when they say that if these decisions draw a line illegitimately, we don't have to obey it. But wait a minute, that is a different proposition altogether. Saying that the courts are not the supreme final word on a basic question forever is not the same as saying we can just defy them. And a federal judge, Judge McConnell, in the head of the Rhode Island District Court, said just a few days ago, and this is the first time I think in our history it's literally been true. He said that the Trump administration is defying his rulings about spending money in accord with Congress, and he set a hearing for whether they should be held in contempt. That kind of defiance is not standard operating procedure. It is not nothing to see here. It's very important.
What if they are held in contempt? I mean, what does that mean exactly? What if they ignore that,
Well,
that ruling?
that is an additional crisis. Um, if a federal district court says to Emile Beauvais, who appears in his court and says, I don't have to obey you, we don't have to spend this money, it doesn't accord with our priorities, even though it is Congress that has the power of the purse, he can say, Emile, you've got to go to jail. And he's got US Marshals that can back him up. Now, it's true that the US Marshals ultimately have to answer to Pam Bondi, the US Attorney General, and she can say, I'm with Emile. But, at that point, even though courts have conducted themselves in a number of cases, like the abortion case, in ways that a lot of people have come to find really distasteful and disgusting and depressing and not really warranted. And even though some Supreme Court justices have conducted themselves in ways that look deeply conflicted and corrupt and illegal under 28 US Code Section 455A, even though that's true, I think there still may be, and here I don't know for sure, enough residual respect in America for the rule of law and the fact that judges must be obeyed, that the Attorney General would not successfully prevent the marshals from imprisoning officials of the executive branch who are responsible for defying judicial orders. Now, when some southern states defied the desegregation orders, President Eisenhower used the military, the National Guard and the Air Force, used the military to tell governors who were standing in the courthouse door to step aside. If we had a president who gave a damn about the rule of law, he might invoke the military to enforce the orders of courts that are saying to him and Musk, you guys have overstepped.
But come on,
There's
we
no way
don't.
that's going to happen.
I was going to say we don't have that.
No,
So
you don't have it.
that seems to be a moot exercise to even imagine it. But
No,
it
that's right.
sounds to me, Larry, that
It's fantasy land. I was just imagining it just to make clear how fantastic it is.
I have a question for you to reiterate. It sounds like you have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court issuing a strong ruling against Trump as a way to perhaps
Well,
assert its authority.
that overstates it. A lot of faith, no. I do think when it comes to a clash between genuine executive power and lawmaking and spending power, the power of the purse, the court is more likely than not, that's about as far as I'd go, to hold up the separation of powers and force the congressional power of the purse against executive usurpation. But there are an awful lot of ways that the court can duck. Um, Depends on how the case comes to it, what the procedural posture is, who the parties are. Famously, I mentioned a few minutes ago Marbury versus Madison. Remember, that was a case in which the court managed simultaneously to say, we have the power to invalidate an act of Congress, and we have the power to invalidate an act of the president. But it managed to do it in a way that did not require that it issue any order at all to the president or the secretary of state, who were the parties in that case, because it feared that if it did issue such an order, it might be defied. Instead, it established the principle and then stepped back. And it was a long time between 1803 and 1857 before the court again invalidated an act of Congress. That time, the next time, it was invalidating the Missouri Compromise, which triggered, among other things, a little thing called the Civil War. So the court's experience in directly confronting the other branches indicates that it has techniques for avoidance, for ducking and bobbing and weaving rather than entering the ring and potentially getting knocked out.
And it does sound as if some of the language coming from Chief Justice John Roberts, that he does believe in judicial review, right?
Yeah, he believes in his own branch, and he does so, I think, to a fault. I mean, he says it's not nice for my colleagues in some of their dissenting opinions to question the legitimacy of our holdings. Well, it may not be nice, but it's true. He's basically saying, don't criticize us. That's ridiculous. We should be free to criticize whether we are justices or simply observers. But it's one thing to criticize, and it's another thing to defy openly and to say, you have jurisdiction over me, you've told me what to do, and I say, you know, stuff it. That is really a formula for chaos. The law of the jungle, anarchy. And anarchy is pleasant for King Kong, maybe, for the people with the most power. But for the rest of us who don't have all the money and power and who depend on the law to protect us, anarchy is threatening. And that's really the key thing I would say about Danielle Sassoon and all of the kerfuffle in the Justice Department. I'm afraid that for most people, that looks like inside baseball. You know, let them fight it out. Who cares what's going on in that gray building in Washington? Too many people occupying too many offices anyway. I'm going to go about my life. That's how most people look at it. That's just inside baseball. What they may not realize is that it is part of an overall pattern that, as it settles in, gives completely unelected people authority over their lives, over your life, over your personal data, over everything. Now, one response to that is, well, that's what the deep state always has been, a bunch of unelected bureaucrats. It's easy to demonize the deep state. But in fact, all of these unelected bureaucrats, these relatively faceless civil servants, it turns out, with relatively few exceptions, are doing the job that the Congress we elect, subject to unfortunate things like gerrymandering, they're doing the job that Congress gave them in the laws of the United States. That's not what Elon Musk is doing. He and these software engineers and young lawyers and AI types are appointed by no one. They're simply, looked at by a gawking Donald Trump who looks up at Elon Musk in amazement and thinks, God, he must be so wise and wonderful because he's so rich. I mean, that's the mindset of this guy. He's a sociopathic narcissist who believes that money is everything, that greed is good, and that the guy who has the most money must be
The smartest.
the smartest and the one we should listen to.
I wanted to ask you one other question about birthright citizenship before we go. Some have suggested that striking down the executive order to end that, which I guess is in the 14th Amendment, you tell me, that
Right
that
there.
might be a smart move because it would be quote unquote hard to disobey. Can you explain that thinking?
Sure. I mean, basically, birthright citizenship is a word for what the 14th Amendment did in response to Dred Scott. It said that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state they live in, state in which they reside. So it's an automatic thing. You're born in US territory, and although there are complicated cases like what is US territory, is the Panama Canal Zone part of it? That was involved for John McCain. But if you are born in the United States, you become a citizen automatically. And if you are naturalized in the United States or anywhere, you're a citizen. So those people who are born in the United States to people who themselves are not citizens are nonetheless citizens. And unlike a lot of other things, this is kind of automatic. And for Trump to defy it, he would have to start deporting US citizens. And it would be very easy for a court to issue an order preventing that. So that would be one of the areas where the president's absurd exercise of power well beyond what is permitted by the Constitution could be stopped by the courts, and I think will be.
Talking to you makes me realize how fragile our democracy is. Do you think it will survive intact given what we've witnessed these past few weeks?
Well, I think it is no longer intact. The question is how and when and over what period of years or decades will we be able to rebuild it? Do I think it will be doomed and gone forever? No. Do I think this last best hope of human beings and of human civilization will be reconstructed over time with difficulty? I think that's up to all of us to determine. I don't think that's predetermined. I think it's a question of how hard we work on it. It's, in a way, it's become a cliche to repeat what Benjamin Franklin said about whether we would have a republic. And famously, he said, yes, we have left you a republic if you can keep it. And whether we keep it is up to us. I don't think it's something that's written in the stars.
Harvard Law professor Larry Tribe, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. You're an American treasure, I think, and I feel so honored that you were able to spend this time with us today.
Thank you. That's very sweet of you, Katie. I think you are a great treasure. You've made a huge contribution as a journalist and a commentator, and
I think we're
honored.
official members of the Mutual Admiration Society.
Right.
Anyway, thanks again, Larry. So
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
Katie.